some uses for Azure Spatial Anchors. There are multiple apps that you can create with Azure Spatial Anchors. A really good use case is anytime that you need to tie a specific information to a specific place. For example, if you're in a big building and if you want your users to find their way around, you can put breadcrumbs around and they can detect these spatial anchors and find their way. Another good use case is if you're in a big supermarket or a warehouse and it's really hard to know where things are, you can put specific product information to specific places. So when you're far away, you can see which way to go depending on your purpose. And these are all business use cases. For a more fun application, check out Minecraft Earth.
The process of discovery for developing enterprise XR solutions. And so really what we mean by that is the process of understanding. You could put you that would help. And so really, like I said, going through a structured process of really understanding requirements for an XR solution, specifically for industry and enterprise kind of applications. And so before we get into it, I'll give you a little bit of background on me and why specifically I've been working in this area and was asked to do this. And so I spent about 15 years in the military at various levels, and after that, I went to graduate school and led strategic research for about 8 years for the U.S. Department of Defense on a number of areas, ground robotics, simulation, areas like that. And one of the big areas that we looked at was training simulations, how much fidelity was needed for these really high-end and expensive systems. And after that, I left and started my own company in 2017, Zylter, the one that's listed down here to the right. And one of my key roles, in addition to running Zylter, was being Chief Strategy Officer for a Series C extended reality company for about 3 years. Tailspin Reality Labs, which is based in Los Angeles, where I'm at today. And so really there, what we were doing is what many of the folks on the call are probably doing, which is taking existing and new technology and trying to put that into initially bespoke solutions where individual clients would come and say, hey, I need you to build me a simulation that does this. I need a training experience that does this, or an AR tool that can help us with this process. And then towards the end, really the focus was taking that development and trying to make scalable products based on it. And so I'll address both, but that's really the intent of discovery, is either for a bespoke project when you've got a new client and you've got to really understand how they do a particular task or sequence so that you can appropriately simulate it or support it in extended reality, or the opposite side of that, which would be before you've got a client, really going through the process of leveraging subject matter expertise to inform design of the scalable product that will be useful. And so I just talked a little bit about it, but why discovery in XR? The reason why, and it is the main reason, is in order for XR resources to be effective, they're generally recreating a world. In virtual reality, they're literally recreating a world. In augmented reality, they're not completely recreating the world, but they definitely take inputs from the world. And so in both cases, it's this very immersive piece. And so making that really effective requires a number of layers of information. And I'll go into this in just a minute, but it's really summed up. If I could leave with just one framework to leave in your pocket, it would be the Sociotechnical Systems model to the right. That when we look at a particular solution, and like in this case, it's represented on the right with equipment, what we've got to really do to make that really effective and have the intended outcomes in terms of learning outcomes or improvement of tasks, task efficiency, those kind of outcomes that the clients are looking for. We've really got to deeply understand all these other areas. And starting from the top, it's really the tasks and processes that we're either replicating in virtual reality or trying to augment and modify and make more efficient with augmented reality. And then the organizing structure. So what we find within industry is oftentimes these tasks are not done by one solitary person. They're done by multiple people, teams of people now, and in the future even more so. Because as we know, one of the big draws of augmented reality is now you can connect multiple people into a shared reality or shared set of geolocated information. And so really trying to understand what is the organizing structure behind this particular task and how it's going to get done to better understand how our solution needs to support that. And then at the bottom there is the workforce and users, which is immensely important because oftentimes what we find in industrial settings, the people that we're building this for aren't necessarily natives to the internet even, but especially to virtual and augmented reality tools that oftentimes when they use the solutions we're delivering, it's the first time that they've really used virtual reality or augmented reality. And so really better understanding them, their level of knowledge, their level of comfort, but also how do they communicate information?
Parana.
One more time, if everybody could mute, that would help immensely.
Yeah, mas.
And so,
Não tenho ouvido.
So as I said, the workforce and users are particularly important since they're the ones who are going to be immersed in this and really understanding their terminology and how they go about the tasks that they do, especially if there's industry standards for what they do, is really making sure that the experience reflects and aligns with those standards. And make sure the training is effective. The last piece, which is probably the most important and one of the reasons why we leverage XR so much for training and why it's so effective, is the operating environment. So all these pieces really exist within a particular operating environment. It could be out on a factory floor, it could be on a job site, it could be in a number of different areas. And the nature of the task and how it's done can really change if you change that operating environment. So we spend a lot of time really trying to deeply understand what is the operating environment and how is it going to impact how the tasks are done or trained, and therefore what it means for the solution design itself. So now I'll go into an overview of it. And so over the last 3 years of having done this, we've built a number of frameworks to first communicate to ourselves and then to clients and then to other parts of the organization. What's the point of discovery and where does it fit in the development process for XR solutions and products? So here you go. Here is kind of the left to right where we oftentimes fit. So usually what we've seen working with a range of clients or XR builders is that XR discovery usually falls about the same place, where most of the companies that we've worked with don't go to full scale adoption right off the bat. They usually start with some sort of pilot phase where they adopt it for a small set of users and then expand. And so usually what that requires is discovery to really build a solution for them. Or if it's a more scalable off-the-shelf solution, there is still usually a phase of tailoring to make it specific to them and their standards and interoperable with their systems. And so what we see is if we look from left to right with how we generally engage with commercial companies and the government as well, even though they're more structured, follows the similar engagement approach. So the first piece is usually initial engagement, and that can take months oftentimes of really talking with them, understanding where their needs are, where they're looking to invest, where they see they can leverage XR in their enterprise. And then usually we'll get to some point where they say, okay, of all of these, here's the one or two I really want to take a look at. And so we'll go into a scoping process. Now that one's hard because we're really trying to figure out how do we propose to them how big this project needs to be. What's the solution going to cost when a lot of the information that we're going to need to really effectively scope doesn't come until after we get started. It comes well into discovery. And so one of the consistent challenges is trying to effectively scope this and manage complexity, knowing that when you get into discovery, you're going to learn a lot more that may drive more complexity than you'd intended and therefore more cost. And so usually the XR discovery is really the first phase. After the scope of work is signed, we will usually go into a fairly intensive process. It's usually 4 to 6 weeks of really trying to hurry up and compile as much information as possible. The reason why that is each of the parts of the organization, especially the engineers, the artists, the people really, that have to be engaged to build the solution. As soon as we sign the scope of work, and usually before, are asking, where's our information? They want to start their planning process. So take, for example, art. They require development of particular assets. So they want to know very quickly, what are the assets that are going to be required here? How many of these do we already have? And therefore, how many more do we need to build? At what level of fidelity? Those are all questions that are answered by discovery. And so that's why when the discovery starts, it's usually a very intensive process to really drive that and get the information needed. Now, usually that runs right into pilot adoption. Like I was saying before, from what we've seen, they usually don't go for broad-based adoption right off the bat. They want to adopt it for 1 or 2 groups or 1 or 2 applications. And usually a big part of the pilot adoption is the assessment to demonstrate that the pilot worked or had the intended effects or the intended ROI. And so a lot of the discovery really focuses on what are we going to need to be able to prove during this pilot adoption so that we're successful and can move to scaled adoption, which is where each company we've worked with wants to get from the 50 or 100 focus group to enterprise-wide adoption. And like I said, usually that requires really demonstrating ROI that starts with understanding how do they view ROI in the discovery process. So, and as I go through this, if you've got questions, comments, thoughts, please jump in. I cannot see everybody because my screen I'm in presentation mode, but please just jump in, turn off the mute and jump right in if you have a question or, hey, what is this or what is that? So one of the things that we've built over time through experience is really a framework to capture what are all the different steps that have to be done for an enterprise to adopt an XR solution. We've worked with AT&T, Farmers Insurance, many others as well in this process. And so it's not exactly the same every time, but almost every time it includes these particular phases, these 6 phases you see along the top. And it usually starts with the organization understanding what their needs are. Usually when we find them, they know generally, hey, we need help here, or this is a process that we think that XR can be helpful with. It's usually up to us to help with them really refine that, get more specific about the use cases, so then that we can go to the next step, which is really looking at options and building out the business case. For each one of these, I'll discuss them briefly and then go in a little more detail so you can actually read them. And then after the fact, this will be streaming and I can share these slides as well if you reach out to me. And so each of these blocks really represents something that has to be done. Now, oftentimes it's not done completely by us as the XR developers. It's split between us and the client. It varies somewhat, but oftentimes, especially with large enterprises, they have internal teams that have been thinking about many of these areas for a long time. So really the first step of this process for us is usually deciding which ones of these need to be addressed during discovery. And so here's an example. I've grayed out the ones were oftentimes done by the internal client themselves, and the ones that remain in yellow are usually ones that will all or part will fit into a discovery project. And as you see, some of these are very short, such as identifying tech-enabled outcomes. Like, how do they see themselves better off with the solution that is going to be adopted, and how do they go about measuring it? And then defining use cases. Those are not extensive. They're usually 1 page each, but they are pretty dense and require an awful lot of input from subject matter experts. And then when you move to the right, those pieces are often more detailed. And so each project is a little bit different based on what they want and where they're at in the stage of the process. But when we get down to develop deployment plan, those can often be quite detailed, as you can imagine and probably know from your own experience. And so the reason why, as I addressed before, we do a structured discovery process, because prior to this, for us, just like many companies, it was pretty casual. It was get our engineers in a room with the subject matter experts, and the subject matter experts, we hoped, would say, build it this way, and this way. So what we found out through experience is that it really did not work. And the reason why is because the users are used to communicating in how they do their job, and implicit in that discussion is user requirements. But they don't think in user requirements the way we as technology designers may. So what you've got to be able to do is listen for that, and then when you hear it, be able to collect more information on it, really frame it, but also be able to communicate it back systematically to the engineers that are really listening for technical requirements. What they really want to know is, what does the solution need to do? But, to address the user needs. And so that's where this really structured discovery process came from, is the need to be able to systematically listen and understand processes, understand the user needs that are implicit in those processes, and then systematically translate those solution requirements back to engineers or solution designers that could then figure out how to either adopt or adapt an existing product to meet the requirements, or build something new from scratch or nearly scratch to build those requirements. So usually when we're going through these, we're focused on either what we call an object or process-based solution. And by object, I mean, oftentimes it'll be focused on particular design, inspection of objects, whether it be a component of a vehicle, say, or in some cases we did an air conditioning unit where somebody needed to inspect it and do maintenance on it. It's very much focused on the object itself, as opposed to more process-based ones where they're trying to teach and impart to the user, here's this process you go through, here's all the steps. The reason why those two are different is the level of fidelity required for object-based applications is generally higher, because the object has to really look like and to a great extent function like the object that they're going to see in the real world, as opposed to more process-based applications where it's really more about making sure they know what to do in the right order, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in as great a fidelity. And so when we really go in and do that, I don't think I have it included here in this deck, but we'll look at 4 different areas of fidelity. The first is task fidelity, and then object fidelity, functional fidelity, and environmental fidelity. And I'll explain each one briefly and why they matter. So the first thing is task fidelity. To what extent will the resulting XR solution, simulation, if you will, does it need to resemble the actual process that's done on the ground? In most cases, the requirements for task fidelity is very high, because they're trying to train with this and really help their workforce go faster. So it has to actually resemble the task they're going to do. The more that we abstract that task process, the less value it has for them, usually. And it does vary. The next one is object fidelity. And so that one is really, to what extent do objects in the simulation look like they do in real life? So for ones that focus on inspection and maintenance, oftentimes object fidelity needs to be quite high for the object itself. and so that they know where to look for specific items or specific indicators, as opposed to some of the hand tools they use in that particular case can be lower object fidelity because they know what a wrench looks like. They don't need it to be a perfect replica of a wrench. They just need it to represent the wrench, to know I got to grab the wrench here to modify this piece of the object. The next piece, and by far the hardest from what we found, is functional fidelity. And so functional fidelity is to what extent do the objects function and interact in the simulation the way they do in real life. And the reason why this one is so hard is, from what we found, this one most drives complexity and therefore cost of the end solutions. Because, so for example, if I hit a piece of metal with a hammer in a simulation, is it going to dent? Does it need to dent for the particular training effect? Because if it has to dent, the amount of work that has to be done by our coders and developers to make it respond that way is really significant. And then when you look at every response that you may have to have within a simulation, as you can see, it gets very complex very quick. And so usually as we're going in and scoping, it's really how can we manage that functional complexity, knowing that it's going to be the main driver of cost. The last piece is environmental complexity. So that's really everything that's going on around the person and the object or the task they're doing. So for example, if it's something that they do outside in the forest, to what extent is having trees there or the right trees there important or part of the task or simulation? And that one can drive cost somewhat, but not near as much as functional fidelity. And so those are the areas that we really look at as we're trying to go into this and go through this discovery process, because those are the inputs our solution designers need to figure out how detailed does it need to be to meet the client's needs, especially within the cost constraints we have. And so also what we see as we go into this is really discovery serves functions at different levels of the organization as we go in. So at the strategic level, which is usually the management executive level who signs the scope of work and approves for the project, it's really more about ROI and whether it's worth the long-term investment, and kind of proving to them through this process where it will have the greatest impact and where they will see the greatest return on investment. This part is also important if you want to go to a follow-on or larger project. It's really demonstrating value. The next piece is at the operational level, which is really where more for us as developers, which is getting the essential information we need to build a VR or XR or VR AR tool or some other XR tool that really delivers the ROI that we're looking at the strategic level. And so that one is really the detail part that we focused on here. You'll see some other stuff here that kind of addresses the strategic or ROI piece, but really most of the focus is on better understanding what do they actually do with this? How is it done? How will they use the solution that we're going to provide as part of that? And so in terms of outcomes for the discovery process, the big ones you see down the left here, there's a good bit of text more for reference, but down the left here, the big things are we have to be able to identify and prioritize the user needs, because at the end of the day, it really is the intended point is to address the user needs, and then validate the solution requirements based on those needs. Usually we'll go in with a starting identification what we think the requirements are. The process really has to validate those and make sure that we have the right set and the right prioritization there. And then one of the biggest important areas of this is really structuring this information in a way that our developers can readily use and reference. Oftentimes, what we give them is 80 or 100 slides long, and not because it's a briefing, it's really a reference book that they'll use for weeks and oftentimes months. As they're building it, they'll pull it off the shelf. Or we've got massive matrices that fit on posters that include information, and I'll show some examples that are really meant for them to tack on the wall as they're developing, to have this structured information to say, okay, what are they doing next? What are the key inputs to that? What are the considerations, areas of risk, those kind of areas? And then the last piece here, which is really important when we look at long-term revenue and how do we scale this and how do we grow the company? It's really making sure that we understand what's going to be required for program level adoption, more broader adoption within the company and in the market as a whole. And so now I'll go through a project as a kind of an example that, usually what we would do is take a project and break it down into tasks, because that's what we will use to scope the discovery effort itself and say, okay, here's how long this is going to take. Here's what's going to cost us internally. How do we build this into the larger solution budget? And here you go. And here's one example. Now, each one is a little bit different, but they're usually all some variation of this, where they start with really defining the use case for each application that we're going to look at. In some cases, we've done ones where there's 10 to 13 of these at a time. Like one we did for a international training organization that does virtual training and did 13 different labs or modules. And so we had to do this process 13 times, really. And then the next piece is really mapping the user requirements. And so really trying to be very structured and systematic about what are they actually doing and what are their requirements through this, so we can make sure we're addressing them. And then from there, we can really start translating that into solution requirements. And then what you see in 4 and 5 is more those strategic tasks I talked about, which is usually not so much focused on the solution itself, but more helping the organization figure out where and how they want to adopt this and roll it out, and how we're going to prove out the efficacy of these particular solutions. And I'll go through each one and provide some examples of each one. So like I said, the first one is really this use case model, and you'll see up there the Sociotechnical Systems model I talked about before. And usually what we're trying to do is come up with a very concise, usually one-page summary of the use case itself, so that we can put that back in front of the end customer or user and say, is this right? Do we have it right? Is this what you're focused on? In some cases, it's not fully been decided when we start what exactly we'll do. So we'll use the use cases as a way to capture and put them side by side. The other reason is for our designers who have to do things like estimate development costs. This use case summary is really essential for them to give them the context about how much fidelity is needed, how much interoperability or connectivity with other existing systems is going to be required, those kind of things. And so I hit this before, don't really need to go into great detail again, but it comes back to this socio-technical system of really trying to get the information we need in a structured way to understand each piece of the socio-technical system for each individual application that we're building. Here's some examples from the first kind of 2 tasks of that process from one we did. And this was on air conditioner repair. But what you see is they are very detailed and structured. And as I said, these are really intended to be used for oftentimes weeks and months by the designers themselves. And so it's immensely important to capture and organize all of that detail. And here's some examples of how we generally will do that. There's another one, and this is kind of usually the next step, because for them the slides are helpful, but what they really need to know is what's going to be done and what are these various inputs. And so in this next one, usually what we've got to do, and this is with input of the subject matter experts themselves, is really map out what's being done for this particular solution or experience. And here's one. You can't really read it that well. It's blurry because this is actually a 2 meter by 3 meter poster that we put on the wall when we're done. It's a massive Excel spreadsheet, but moving from left to right, what it does is it lays out each task and subtask, describes each, what's entailed and what they're going to do, what are the big learning or task execution outcomes of that task or step, what are the physical interactions. So for example, what tools are they using? How are the tools connected? Those kind of things are really important. The next one is the method of measurement. Immensely important, because we need to know, especially for training ones, how do they figure out if this task has been done correctly and proficiently and can move on to the next. And then we'll look at essential assets and resources. What from our asset library is going to be needed? Wrenches, tools, specialty equipment, whatever that is. And then we've got potential issues and hazard areas, because oftentimes those have to be highlighted in the experience, because they need to make sure, one, that the user doesn't do them, and number two, that they really understand where that risk area is when they go out to do it in a real world application. And then as we move to the right, feedback. What are the cues that the solution's going to need to provide back to the user themselves to let them know that they did it correctly or not? And so task 3 here is usually what we have to do at this point is try to put some numbers to these to say, okay, which ones of these are we going to do based on the return on investment? So this table over here has a lot of information in it, but usually this is kind of the level of detail we have to get to for each one of these modules to say, okay, how much does the current delivery mode cost? How applicable is XR going to be for this particular task, because or module? Because what we see is there's certain tasks where, although XR can be used, it's not really the best and highest use of it. So, for example, reviewing paperwork, you could do that virtual reality or augmented reality, but it's not really the best use of the technology or medium, as opposed to inspecting for damage, which is a great application. And so usually we're going through to figure out how much do they currently spend on these, and then where is it most applicable? Where do we see potentially additional value of having an extended reality solution? So for example, if it's one where people will benefit from doing a hands-on activity multiple times, that is one usually where there's high payoff from XR, because you can do it over and over. Or where there's constrained lab space to do it, where you have to go into a lab and do it, but many people have to, so you don't get that much time. Being able to replicate that in XR for practice is a significant area of value. And so usually we've got to lay these out in a structured way to say, okay, this is why this is the ones that we would focus on next, especially when it comes to a long-term adoption roadmap. That oftentimes when we're working with people, they may come with a small set of modules to start with, but the whole idea is that they're going to adopt it for a much broader range of tasks and functions going forward. And I should have done this earlier, but here's a bigger version of it so you can kind of see what that looks like. And so, as I said, it's really trying to get down to some measure of what is the value of this, of XR for this particular solution relative to how they do it currently. And then usually the next step of this is really trying to prioritize and say, okay, based on the assessments we've done, here's where the greatest ROI is going to be, and trying to figure out what the cost of that is going to be. Because most organizations, especially once we get to the strategic level, they want to know, what is it going to cost? What is it going to save us? How do they make this argument to their management, their board, on why this long-term approach to adopting extended reality will have value? And here's kind of a blow up of it. And this was for something else. I think this was for actually around insurance, but was really showing, hey, these are the ones where adoption will have the greatest impact for us. And it was ones where they were really reliant on the environment or objects, or in some other cases where they needed to practice interactions like voice activated conversational interactions were all ones. And so it was really to highlight that. And then the last piece is usually pulling all that into a roadmap. And like I said, it can vary. Sometimes we end with just, let's get the information so we can build the solution and move forward. But usually most of the organizations we're working with want to know, okay, what order should we be rolling these things out? The other reason why we try to include this in discovery is this gives us a view of where they want to go long term, so we can start thinking about what would the next scope of work be. That when we get this module delivered and accepted, where are they going to want to go next? So we're kind of out in front of them and really thinking about their needs as or before they are. And here's a blow up of it. And this one's very conceptual, but usually what they're trying to do is, like, if we go in and build out, let's say 10 or 15 modules, they'll usually want to try to put them into some sort of sequence or grouping, because oftentimes they build on each other. Especially for virtual reality training, it will often, build in a sequence. And so we will kind of prioritize all the modules based on ROI, but then there's a process of trying to sequence those to say, okay, how do you make a learning progression out of these investments so that people can move from one to the next in an actual experience and not just have a bunch of individual training modules. And at the end, we'll end up with a roadmap, something like this. And you can't really see that right here, but it's really, here's all the tasks and actions that are going to have to be done to adopt it at scale across the priority functions. And here's what this looks like, going forward. This is really important oftentimes for them, because if they want to go back and secure more money in the organization, these are all things they have to go back and show their organization. Here's the ROI. Here's the sequence we want to build them out. Here's the timeline for development that we need if we're going to get it out there. And so oftentimes these are designed really more, it's for their use than ours, so that our internal advocates, can go back and sell the next phase of the project or more scaled adoption. And so that's kind of what one project can look like. Like I said, it can vary. It depends on the level of detail or what we need at that particular time. Or if the client's already got a very good idea of where they want to go, then it may just be, hey, focus on getting information so we can build this solution. The other way it can appear is if we're trying to build a more market-based product, where we say, hey, we know there's a market opportunity here. We want to build a scalable product and then go get customers for it. We'll oftentimes do a kind of internally funded or supported discovery effort to say, okay, what would that look like? What standards would it need to align with if I want to sell it broadly? And so I put back here just a couple of examples or resources, because as you can see, we pull from these often and reuse them in many different ways. Here's the Sociotechnical Systems model I described before, with information around it to describe what each element really captures and why it's important. Here's an outcome from one of the internal studies we did around inspection. And really what it was focused on is identifying all the potential use cases around inspections so that we could focus in on the ones that we thought were most scalable and had the largest market to guide internal development decisions. For that particular one, we got in great detail at this level. Now, we very quickly took these and put them in a spreadsheet and triaged them. We did not go after developing all of these, because each one of these could be their own extended reality, whether it be virtual or augmented solution. I think in this case, we were focused mainly on augmented reality, but this was the starting point, which was this kind of taxonomy of what are all the different use cases we could go after. And then from there, we bend them and synthesize them to say, here's the ones that we are most well suited based on our capabilities, relationships, existing customer base, and then the ones where we saw the greatest market opportunity, that were the most scalable. And once again, here's an example of the use case template that we usually use. That this captures each of those key elements I was talking about. In this case, it was for a facilities inspection, but to really show here's what's required. And then oftentimes we'll put in information and links because a lot of this exists on the internet, and there's usually examples on the internet. So we try to leverage as much of what's out there as possible and not recreate it for our developers so that they can use this as a desk reference. And then oftentimes for these use cases, we may have to go in a little bit greater detail for the ones we're more interested in. And that's where we'll look at what's the knowledge, who are the users, what's the environment, variance of solution requirements. In this case was immensely important for scalability. So for ones where there was a high variance of solution requirements, oftentimes we'll kind of veer away from those because that means from a development cost perspective, we're going to have to develop a number of environments. It's just going to be more costly and less scalable. So really where we're focused on usually is the ones where there's low variance of solution requirements, because that points to something that's more scalable that we can sell many times to many customers without significant modification. And so I think that is it here. And I know that that was a lot of information to go over there. But I'd be happy if you've got thoughts, comments, or questions to field any you have. Okay, well, with that, I appreciate everybody tuning in. I'd be happy to answer more questions. If you need to contact me or follow up offline, please let me know. We work with a number of different companies now at various stages of development that are really focused on applying this process as we get time. And so be happy to discuss what you're doing and see if it applies, makes sense, or just generally discuss and share.